Hey, I just want to thank everybody for being willing to come back. And my technology wasn't working quite well last week, and I'm really happy that you were willing to come back so we could go ahead and finish. And I have moved from the Northland now, and I'm sitting in Prairie Village. Hopefully the technology will work a little bit better today. This morning there was a comment on the news channel that I thought I could start the class out with, because it's kind of identifies where we're going today. And the statement was, history is a study of the past. Imagine another future. And I think with all the things that we're looking at today, with the COVID, the virus, and all the things that are happening in the world today, to begin to look and see our future and begin to look at a future that staying positive, that getting through this, and when we do break through it, then looking at a future. I want to end this class today talking about potential moving forward. But before we get there, we'll kind of move through and finish up some of the areas that we're going through, some of the philosophies that kind of set a pattern of thought and so on. And so just a very quick review of what we covered last week. American colonialism at what cost to us. And this is more about talking about the culture or the society as a whole today are leading into that. The two worlds in America. Then we talked about the human socio-political organization and the two basic types, tribal and state. What type serves the individual? And we're talking about you and I, we're talking about our children and our grandchildren. What type of society serves? I think that's the litmus test. Which type of society serves the individual the best? And then we talked about the different types, the two basic kinds of societies here. Looking at masculine, feminine balance, that's just a review of what we've covered over the last 5-6 weeks. Consensus building democracies and balance and harmonization, nurturing children inside out into sense of self. And then we looked at the state, property-based, the power of the few. And we talked about masculine domination. One of the key things we looked at with that is the rise of abstract ideologies and what happens in a state level of socio-political system with that. And then we came into here and brought us right up to the present. Are we at a tipping point? And with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and since that happened, going back into a whole series of killings in Denver, Aurora, Colorado. I saw that, and I'm just thinking, it almost brought tears when they were talking about that young man that was killed there, and then all these other people. So this is a picture of Kansas City. Demonstrations going on both in the downtown area and also on the plaza. And then we talked about the thing that triggered all this, the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And another issue we're looking at seriously is the spread of COVID-19. And I've been watching this on a daily basis, to see where we're at in the nationwide, as well as where we are in our own metropolitan area, which seems to be spiking up. So I think it's a good thing we're doing this on Zoom, and we're able to continue as it seems to be spiking here in the metro. And so I added this slide after going through that last week. Oppositional forces in societies, the rising power of industries. Industries are institutions. Like all institutions, there's a tendency of institutions to expand and focus on self-interest and so on. So what is there as a countervailing force to kind of keep institutions from overexpanding? And so I put in here, ethics and law are supposed to act as countervailing forces to institutionalization. So then looking at this, law floats above us, ethics weaves its way within us. These are two forces. Law enforcement, kind of being above us, and it's like kind of the watchful eye that we stand in line, but ethics is more of an interpersonal, and it's also a professional. Like I came out of the field of education, and in that field we had certain specific ethical types of behavior we were to maintain in that profession. And the medical profession, the legal profession, professions have these rules. Are not always identical, but the ways of maintaining a certain specific kind of order and a way of maintaining or doing the right thing. There's also another one here too, which I think is a third one outside of those two. Ethics deals with more of a profession, the way I'm thinking about this, how you conduct yourself professionally, but also how do I conduct myself out in community? And that to me has to do with taking personal responsibility. I am responsible to my community to do the next right thing. And I think, and that personal responsibility can change. It's very contextual. So applying that to COVID-19, what we're seeing happening in the country now is this idea of this human health issue is a very powerful issue now. And at the same time, we also have an issue in our economy. And in between the human health issue, human life, it's become, because of the COVID-19, it's become a versus. Human health versus our healthy economy. And so there's a struggle here going on between the two. And so a lot of states opened up for the economy. And when they did, we have a spike up in the virus and in the death rate. So I just picked one state which opened up. But there are a lot of states, Georgia, Texas, it goes on, Arizona, and so some of these, California, Missouri did some opened up more than others, but we're seeing, I just used Florida as one example. You see what's happened there if you look at the bar graph below. And then I put this in 6/26/2020. So that was, let's see, 4 or 5 days ago, when Florida experienced this tremendous spike up all of a sudden that day. on that particular day, you see the 14, you get this 2-week time period before the spike up can really begin to happen once the exposure has occurred. So now today and yesterday and day before yesterday, Kansas City began to put a new ordinance in that we must, if we're out in public, inside an institution, we must wear a mask. And then other areas in the metro have also instituted the same rule. This is an attempt to begin to pull back and see what we can do about this spike up. And so how this country then is going to handle this clash between the economy and between human health issue now. The conflict that we have going on here with us. Now, the states like Arizona and so on are also beginning to close down again because it's apparent that we opened up a bit too soon. This is something that does not get into the news, and for me, the fact that it does not get in the news is shocking. So, objectification, missing Native American women. The Red Dress Project of Métis artist Jamie Black speaks for hundreds, possibly thousands of Indigenous women and girls who have been murdered or disappeared in the past 4 decades. The red dresses fluttering at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere are an eerie reminder of a prevalent violence. For 7 years, I volunteered to go into both Kansas State Penitentiary and the Federal Penitentiary at Leavenworth to work with Native organizations inside those 2 penitentiaries. In order to be approved to go into Leavenworth, I had to go through an FBI check. And then the check was then put into the National Information Crime Center, it's called ICNC, which is located, or at that time was located in Atlanta, Georgia. So all federal crimes and federal people, volunteers, and employees go into NCIC, into that organization. So I knew to look to NCIC to find out exactly what their records are showing, the federal records are showing about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls by year. So I picked the last 4 years. In 2016, 5,711 Indigenous women and girls were murdered missing on those federal records. 2017, another 5,646 were murdered and missing. 2018, 5,277. Last year was incomplete. When I checked the NCIC records, it only went to the first week of November, so that left the rest of November and December are not included in this figure. But up to the first week of November in 2019, 5,712 Indigenous women and girls were murdered and missing. So you can kind of see, and to me, I have to ask the question, why isn't it in the news? I don't know how many of you have heard about this, but this is happening on such a regular basis. And where does it happen? Uh, can you move this? Okay. Yeah. Excuse me just for a minute here. There we go. This is Michelle Audette, MMIWG, Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, National Inquiry Commission. This is happening both in the United States and Canada. I dream that we, along with other daughters, granddaughters, can walk safely, dig wherever we go, and be respected. I asked the Creator, why did I survive this? I believe because as a survivor, I can speak for my sisters, whose voices were silenced. They never had the opportunity to speak out. So she's actually Canadian, and the same thing's happening in Canada. But those figures only, the ones that I read just in the previous slide, only apply to the United States. So looking back at the history, because most of these are happening on these oil pipelines that are going through. And oil pipelines have man camps, you know, the forces that are there to put in the pipelines. So you have it in North and South Dakota, Arizona, some in New Mexico, Texas, Minnesota, quite a few in Minnesota, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, or just to name some of the. So it's a fairly widespread phenomena that's going on. So it kind of represents the powers of the oil industry itself, because most of those figures are revolving around the construction of these pipelines. So this is takes us back to, there's a history of this, takes us back to 1923. When it says oil and greed led to the 1923 centralization of the Navajo government. So according to treaty agreements to all native reservations in the country, in order to change the treaty agreement, it required 75% of the adult male vote to make any change in the treaties. Now note that it was the adult male vote, not the female vote. The women were not allowed to vote on these changes. Well, Standard Oil discovered oil in the Navajo reservation, and they knew they would never get, because the Dene people or Navajo people are quite traditional, they knew they would never get 75% of the males to agree to exploit that oil that they had discovered. So they went through Congress and got Congress to pass a centralization to develop a Navajo tribal council that would bypass that treaty agreement. And Congress did pass that. And so then Standard Oil went in and lobbied to get certain people elected into the Navajo Council. They agreed that to allow Standard Oil to come in, and that set up the first tribal council in 1923. 10 years later, the Collier Act did that, used that as a model and set up tribal councils, thus bypassing traditional native forms of government and putting a whole new form of governance into the situation. And so in 1933, all reservation governments were centralized. It started with the issue of oil. I don't know how many of you heard about the Osage were given a reservation in Oklahoma. And oil was discovered on their reservation. And suddenly, in the 1920s, there were murders beginning to happen on the Osage Indian Reservation. And there was an organization that was formed by the picture of this man here in the center. This is his last name, Hale, where he would encourage, he kind of formed a gang, and he encouraged them to marry Native women. And these Native women were turning up dead. And because of the marriage, the person then inherited the oil rights. And this went on. They finally called the FBI, the newly formed FBI, in. The FBI discovered that Hale was responsible for 24 murders. He and another person were leading the gang. And they were finally sentenced to life in prison in Leavenworth. Well, Hale and this other guy, I can't remember his name, served 10 years, and they were pardoned. Hale then went back to Oklahoma. But what shocked everybody was that Hale and some of his gang members were in prison. The murders did not stop. They continued on into the 30s and so on. So the woman over on the left, Angie DeBow, wrote a book, And Still the Waters Run, which blew this wide open and even named certain high officials in the Oklahoma government. And her life was threatened. They never did kill her, but her life was threatened because of that book that came out. Much more recently, I think you probably heard about the Dakota Access Pipeline on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. This is a picture of Marines leading protesters up to the pipeline. This was not covered by the news. It was not covered by the media for about 5 months, in spite of the fact there were about 20,000 protesters trying to stop this pipeline. And what broke it open was about 500 clergy came to Standing Rock. And once the clergy, and then later the veterans came to Standing Rock, and finally the news began to cover it. Broke the news open once the clergy came in there and so on. And then we began to get news on a fairly regular basis about what was going on. The map up on the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a line up above, a broken line. Energy Transfer Partners out of Dallas, the CEO, Kelsey, originally had proposed that line. And they had done a partial environmental impact study, an incomplete one, but the Army Corps of Engineers approved it. Well, the people in Bismarck, North Dakota, complained, and it's mostly an all-white town, basically. complained they didn't want that above their water supply because the Missouri River there that went under furnishes all their water supply. So Energy Transfer Partners moved it south to go right north of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, and the Army Corps of Engineers approved that. And so that's what this protest was all about. Excuse me, was this issue with that oil pipeline. So I put in here how that applies to our sphere that we've been talking about, the Axial Age, borders, masculine domination, and objectification. The patterns continue. Now that pipeline, in spite of the incomplete study, went ahead and was approved. And so they went ahead, this happened after the Obama administration left office. They went ahead and approved that, and they went ahead and put that pipeline in. So kind of pulling that together a little bit, our history is the future. That's by Nick Estes, the Sechangu Lakota, who wrote a book about which I have, and I wish I'd put the title of that book in there, but I forgot to do that. The past is never dead, it's in the present, William Faulkner. And then I have a picture of the Standing Rock march as they're marching to the pipeline again. You'll see the two Native women that were recently elected to Congress. Can you move this again? Yeah. Excuse me just a minute. Yeah, that's good. Two Native women headed to Congress. This is why it matters. Centuries ago, colonists demoted indigenous women from leadership roles. We've been fighting to get them back ever since. Out of the Washington Post. So we're beginning to pull our 6-week presentation together here on the Axial Age. And I'd like to, after we kind of pull this together, I'd like to open it up for comments. The Axial Age, outcomes and costs. Child rearing, we dealt with child rearing, and we talked about control rather than nurture, and that's where we showed Washeka. We talked about that. And as an educator, spent 44 years in the classroom. Educational system K through 12, content versus critical thinking. And once you get into college level, you begin to get more critical thinking. Still a lot of content, of course, but you begin to get more. But very little, if any, K through 12. Values, materialism versus relationships. We've covered that pretty heavily through the 6 weeks. Status, class system, power, control versus equality. Excuse me. Structured to protect those in control. Then the last one will require, I think, additional explanation. Rigidity versus flexibility, abstract ideology. You would think, I would think on the surface, abstract ideology, well, I have a choice. I can choose one, I can choose the other, or I can mix it up, I can do all kinds of things. But what really happens in this abstract ideological process, which is divides the country or divides the society, is that rigidity begins to set in. And willingness oftentimes to move. So I thought I'd bring in James Axtell again, the slide that we had, and reapply it. The quotes out of the European and the Indian. reapply it to this process of rigidity versus flexibility. Exclusivity versus inclusivity. And I put religion versus spirituality in there. Because James Axtell was referring to the difference in native inclusivity when it came to the religion and the European exclusivity. So the first paragraph really deals with native inclusivity. While the Indians developed their secret weapon in the heat of cultural combat, they were seldom, if ever, the aggressor. So the path of least resistance was the extension of the basic Indian toleration of other religions and the correspondent wish to pursue their own. Then, relative to the exclusivity part, they leave everyone in their own belief. It was true, as every missionary knew. But being Christian, they persisted in their attempts to change the Indians. So moving on to further bringing in a kind of summary and pulling this together. What is the nature of nation states empires? The rise and fall of nation states over 5,000 years. I notice the background of the slide has that introductory slide we used 6 weeks ago with that rise and fall, or that kind of flow of ancient Egypt, ancient India, China, the Aegean culture, and so on. Why do they rise again? Is there an addictive nature to the Axial Age process? To materialism and power embedded in the nation states? Just use the oil situation, the Navajo Reservation, Standing Rock, and the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, which kind of relates to that materialism and power embedded in nation states. Do indoctrination and momentum play a part? Are ebb and flow patterns inevitable? I think that's the question that we're faced today in this moment. Is it inevitable for us going forward in the future as we look at the uptick in the COVID-19 and as we look at we're approaching in November an election, and therefore we're going to see the political becoming more and more intense. What is the future? Are these patterns that we've noticed in that background that you see in this slide, with the ebb and flow of these cultures and civilizations, is it inevitable? That becomes the question at this point for our own lives and the lives of our own children and grandchildren. So the slide, the future is before us. And on the left is the Amazon rainforest and the burning of the Amazon. And I put kind of ghost-like pictures up there of indigenous people in the Amazon, and their lands are being invaded at this point. They have a president in Brazil, Bolsonaro, who is encouraging this process of burning the rainforest and so on, clearing it out for industry and farm expansions and that kind of thing. The middle picture represents the growth of our technology. Our technology continues to grow and improve and become more sophisticated. So you have the push button there with the wires going out from that point to represent the growth in and the rising sophistication of our technology. And on the far right, In God We Trust, to represent the monetary motivations and so on. So that's the momentum that we're in right now. And here's another aspect of it. The future is before us. They're showing a forested area which feels pristine, and our choices are clear. Or is there a modification? Is there a corresponding emergence where these two pictures can merge together, still preserving one side of our lives, but also continuing with our technology and our materialistic development. And I'm not saying that the picture on the left with the burning of the Amazon is a good idea, but that should be continued since the Amazon produces 20%, excuse me, of the world's oxygen supply. And by the way, the Amazon isn't the only forest in the world that this is going through. These rainforests are suffering this all over the world. But the Amazon is the largest and is the biggest source of oxygen in the world. So where do we go from here? I've kind of dropped back into European philosophy, and something struck me about Hegel, a German philosopher, professor at universities of Heidelberg, Jena, and Berlin. And something fascinating about Hegel, he came up, one part of his philosophy, he came up with dialectics. But I want to drop back a minute to René Descartes, who's a 17th century philosopher, because Hegel studied René Descartes, and he often lectured in his philosophy classes about Descartes. And I think it's been 60 years since I've had a philosophy course, so I have to pull some of this together, but I think there was a connection between Hegel's dialectics and Descartes' philosophy. This philosophy, cogito ergo sum, which he discovered through that, I think, therefore I am, is the Latin for cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What Descartes was considering was a dichotomy between the mind and the body. And what he concludes is there's this dualism that we all deal with, and that they coalesce. They come together and can operate at one, but the mind can also go separate. And Descartes' philosophy is kind of considering this coalescence in a sense. We're going to talk about coalescence in a few minutes, because I think it's a real significant factor for our future. But there is obvious influence here that René Descartes had on Hegel in the dialectics, the process of how we got to this point. How did we get here? What I like about Hegel's dialectics is it's simple. And we need something simple because society is complex, kind of like a screwdriver, something simple that we can put this complexity into something simple so to make it a little easier to grasp. So The pattern in Hegel's dialectics is that every time a new idea comes about, which he called a thesis, then once a new idea happens and it becomes established, an antithesis happens. Ideas that go against that new idea. And so you have a thesis, antithesis, and that always creates an opposition. There's always an opposition, and the opposition clashes. Sometimes it's a hard clash. Sometimes it's just debates. Sometimes the clash is very physical, and sometimes it's not. But as that happens, if it's a debate or if it's a physical or it becomes dangerous, whatever happens, it eventually emerges into a synthesis. Eventually, the thesis antithesis becomes a single thesis, and then it becomes a thesis. And then there's an opposition, and that goes on and on and on. And looking at that paradigm, not only to look at the past, if you think about ancient Greece, we talked about the playwrights, Sophocles, Aristophanes, we talked about Socrates, the antithesis, the push for democracy. Socrates is against democracy. We also talked about what was going on in China and so on. And you can apply all these things, whether it's Lao Tzu and all these events in history, to this very simple looking dialectics that Hegel came up with. That is kind of an evolutionary process that came out of Descartes. And we can kind of look at these factors going all the way back to ancient Greece and so on, and then leap all the way into today. All the way into the previous slide when we saw the protests in Kansas City. On one hand, we have the established rule of law. And we have the thesis, the rule of law, and we have law enforcement. We have a constitution, which makes it legal to protest. But then we have also at the same time, the antithesis coming in, the protesters. And during the day, this is what's amazing about what was happening here. During the day, we had a mixture of all the races in Kansas City, side by side, in that protest group. And there's been mixtures before, but I don't think near to this extent. It's relative to this extent. And so we have a thesis and antithesis going on right here in our city. And what's going to happen? We have people throughout the country trying to work this out. What do we do? Do we defund the police department? Do we reduce the funds? And do we put some of the reduced funds out of, we take from law enforcement, do we put it into social programs? Do we improve the educational system of our inner city schools, for example, using funds that we were putting into law enforcement? So now we're looking at solutions. Is this a way of trying to build a synthesis in that process? And can that dialectics apply to the people like Wendell Berry? Moving on down on the slide. Wendell Berry is a poet, a philosopher, environmental activist, cultural critic, and farmer. This is what's interesting about Wendell Berry. And he begins to give us a hint about maybe a future. stresses the interconnectedness of life. All life is interconnected. Living in urban areas, we begin to feel a disconnect. What he's trying to say is bringing us back to a sense of maybe we're not really disconnected after all. Maybe we need to look back at this picture a little bit more, begin to reestablish our consciousness, because we've never been disconnected. Just our consciousness has been disconnected. Wendell Berry was also very interested in native cultures, and he's given talks at Loyola University in New Orleans and other places and so on. A very fascinating person with a lot of ideas like this. But he argues that modern America way of life is a skein of violence, a weaving of violence, in other words. The human is derivative, the planet is primary. So he's trying to get us to think back into preserving our environment. And as we're looking at climate change and our issues with climate change, has become one of the major, probably will wind up as a major issue in the debates during the upcoming election as we approach that. But Wendell Berry is really a fascinating person. And then we have a Father Thomas Berry, who passed on in 2009, the PhD in history, Catholic University of America, believed that humanity, after generations spent in despoiling the planet, is poised to embrace a new role as a vital part of a larger independent Earth community, consisting of a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. Felt we are at a critical turning point. But the communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. Referring back to what we've been talking about, relationship-oriented as opposed to object orientation. And was a theologian, practiced theology of the environment, and changed the term to geologian. I think it was an interesting term to coin, representing Father Thomas Berry, who also gave lectures at Loyola University in New Orleans and so on. We find these two people very closely aligned in their approaches. And I tried to find if they were related with the same last name. I couldn't find that they were. Maybe just a coincidence. Then coming back to something else I find fascinating. Can tribal socio-political systems work on a large scale? It's a question that we talked about a few weeks ago too. Can you move this? And there's a anthropologist. Just a minute here. Yeah, good. A well-known anthropologist who changed the thinking. His focus was on demographics, or one of his focuses was on demographics, the study of populations and the distribution of populations. So Henry F. Dobbins, anthropologist, author, and researcher specializing in ethnohistory and demography of Native American, Native peoples in the American Hemisphere. Cornell University, PhD, 1960. Dobbins represents a turning point in the study of demographics. Known for his groundbreaking demographic research on the size of indigenous populations before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. First, his studies showed before 1492, the area north of the Rio Grande was far more heavily populated than previously considered. His first figures came out with 12 million north of the Rio Grande. That include US and Canada. His later studies, he modified that, revised it up to 18 million north of the Rio Grande. The hemisphere, 120 million. Some figures have since gone a little higher than that, but it does represent a population at least equal to that of Europe from the Ural Mountains all the way to the Atlantic coast. That'd be the Ural Mountains about a third of the way through Russia before you get into Asia and all the way to the coast. So what the demographers are now including is that indigenous populations were much larger. And I've also later seen studies that are putting North American population north of the Rio Grande as high as 20 million. The problem with studies like this is that disease was so devastating. And the studies are very difficult to make, the process of trying to go back and trying to study that. But it comes back to our question about socio-political systems and the consensus building democracies that Native peoples for the Jamestown and so on. So I wanted to continue. There's a new idea that's emerged over the last decade, and maybe even a little before that. Are we entering another axial age? Is there a second axial age? Yeah. That's the question that we're beginning to ask. Is there a second axial? And excuse me just a minute. So there's a lecture, and these are off of YouTube, so you can look these people up. Richard Tarnas got his BA at Harvard and a PhD at, the pictures are in my way again. Yeah. Yeah. But this one. Yeah. There we go. Bit of technical difficulty here. Yeah. Yeah, he's a PhD from Saybrook Institute out of California. And he's come up with several ideas. And this lecture that I got this from was about a 50 to 55-minute lecture to what looked like a graduate level college class. And one of the quotes he made, the environment has become ours to exploit. With our advancing technology, our chances of survival are that of a snowball in hell. He talks about a lot. It reminded me of what Wendell Berry and Father Thomas Berry were talking about, that we need to begin to reconnect more with our environment. Not only that, And there's a common theme as I explored through this concept of a second axial age, there's a recurring theme that we need to expand our consciousness beyond our borders. We need to expand our consciousness beyond race, borders, race, to begin to focus more on our similarities, our likeness, and less on our differences. There is a hint in the second axial age that raises the question, are borders, the concept of borders and nation states, antiquated? It's an interesting thought. Are they past, have they outlived their usefulness? There's a kind of that thought that's beginning to emerge here, that are we starting to think in terms of a world community rather than us as individuals and those other people, there's us and them. And Reverend Richard Wright is another one. He was also on YouTube. I got information from him. It's such a really an interesting idea. Are we at the new? Is there, we've had, is there something different? So he was an Episcopal priest, Roger priest in charge at New York. That's okay, yeah. But you moving these pictures around a little bit because it covers what I was going to read. So. There we go. Yeah. So, Reverend Richard Wright, we are at a crossroads. We must change. We must change coexist to coalesce. And it's kind of what we saw in an earlier slide. I thought the word coalesce was really significant because as I thought thought through this process, and he also gave a fairly lengthy talk, maybe a 30-minute talk that I watched. And what I came out with is that there's something about inclusivity instead of having all this exclusivity. And I also thought about masculine domination. Maybe the time for that's over with. Maybe the time is to bring back that feminine balance, that proper restraint that comes in, that part that has wisdom and sees further into the future. And then I thought about all these states that opened up a little bit soon, and now we're getting a spike. Had we had that more feminine side, would that have happened quite this quick? Would there be more of a balance? And when I started thinking about this coalescence, I thought, wow, not only coalescence in our masculine and feminine balance, bring back that feminine side of who we are, so that plays a more important role in the decision-making process going forward. But how about human differences? What does that look like in this coalescence? as opposed to coexisting. So that made me think about my trip to India and my exposure to Hinduism. And I was raised in the Methodist Church. And then I became anchored, my roots became anchored in Native American spirituality. And for the last 40 years, I've been really anchored into Native America and participated in Native American ceremonies in India and stayed in an ashram. And every night we had the Arti ceremony. We went to Arti, which is down on the Ganga River. And there was no lecturing, no preaching. It was just all ceremony for about 2 hours on the Ganga River. And the British changed the name Ganga to Ganges. But if you say Ganges there, they'll correct you and say, no, it's Ganga, which means mother. Ganga Ma, mother, the mother river. So I'm sitting there in Hindu ceremonies, anchored in Native America, but feeling great about being inclusive and loving being there. But I didn't have to lose my anchor to do that. I didn't have to lose where I was rooted in order to be there and participate, even go along and even sing in ancient Sanskrit, these songs. And coming back from there and going back into the sweat lodges over here in Native culture, I saw no conflict. Even though the spirituality, the religions are very different. But there was a beauty in being able to do that. And the Swami had 20 of us come in every night after the Arti. And there was a woman who helped lead the process. About 20 of us would go into a room in the ashram. And we go in quietly because he would be in there meditating. And we'd sit there quietly as long as he was meditating. And then he would signal to her. You'd barely see any signal at all, probably blinked an eye or something. And then she would say, are there any questions? And somebody in the audience would ask a question. And then they would answer the question. And it would take about 40 minutes to answer one question because they covered the entire spectrum, the context that wrapped around the whole question. And it was just a fascinating experience. And even though the religions are very different and the foundational process of them were very different, it was very rewarding to be there and participate in that level of sincerity, because there was so much sincerity and love there. And I think that's what Reverend Richard Wright is talking about when he talks about coalesce. Is that a characteristic that maybe we need to look at, as we move into the second axial age, if that is really a concept? I know it's a concept out there, but it is a reality. And are we on the cusp of it? Is that our future? And that brought to mind, the 27th of June. I don't know how many of you watched it, but the global concert that we've been having recently, One World Together at Home. the global concert, thinking globally. And I put the Lakota word mitakiwiasi in there. We talked about that several weeks ago. Means we're all related. We all came from the same source in the universe 13 to 14 billion years ago. We all came from the same source, whether we're talking about the natural world, we're talking about us humans, we're talking about butterflies. We all began at that same place, and that's mitakiwiasi. And so I'll end this with the world concert and with this final question. Are we in or entering another axial age? Are we in a paradigm shift period of time? And I'd like to open this up to any questions or any comments or anything anybody would like to bring in. If we could, Lori.
Absolutely. Remember, you need to unmute yourself. And if you need assistance with that, send me a chat book or a chat message. I will share that. Alice did share in the chat that there is another nonfiction book on the Osage, Oklahoma Indian murders titled Killers of the Flower Moon by David Gran, who is a New York staff writer. It's also about the origination of the FBI, and Alan has given it his personal thumbs up, and it is apparently a National Book Award finalist.
Yeah, I'll give that my own thumbs up on that one. It's a very good book, and thank you, Alice, for bringing that up. And I had forgotten to bring it up, but I'm glad you did.
Gil?
Yes.
On those 5,000 plus indigenous women that went missing in just 1 year, what are the thoughts on what happened to them? Were most of them murdered? Some of them abducted? What's the thoughts on what happened to them?
They find bodies in rivers and land areas. There's the Badlands. They found some in Badlands and things like that. I'm getting a flash unstable internet. Is everybody hearing me okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. There's the missing probably are women they haven't found yet, plus, and I'm guessing on this, probably in the sex trade, been captured and sold into the sex trade. I know there's an issue here in Kansas City, but I think that's true in almost all of our major cities, where that's going on today. Because it's gone on for some time, but I only got the last 4 years on there. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other discussion or comments? Let's see, Alan, you mentioned a couple of weeks ago you had something you wanted to mention.
Gil, do you?
Say that again. Oh, other axial age? Yeah.
Gil, do you have any predictions as to where the human race is going to go? Are you relatively optimistic, relatively pessimistic, despairing?
I'm about in between.
Yeah.
I'm tossing a coin. I have a lot of emotional attachment to where we're going because I have two sons, and I'm almost 82, and I've had a good life, but I want them to have a good life, and so it's an emotional attachment to this for me, and I see potential going both ways, and I like these people who are talking about the second axial age as a direction that's very encouraging to me if that's possible. I know there'll be a lot of resistance to that. You know, there's people, and I do that too, hang on to what I'm used to. You know, like I mentioned several weeks ago, I'm used to the black daffodil phone as opposed to these cell phone things we got now. More comfortable with that, but also I'm thinking that what these philosophers like Harness are talking about, and you know, what the two Barry, Wendell Berry and Father Barry are talking about, I find very encouraging and very enlightening. That there is that thought out there, and they're offering a potential, and I find that very encouraging. I'd look at our national borders, and are they antiquated? Do we really need that anymore? I know that might be blasphemy, you know, for some people, but I have to wonder on a practical scale, is it blocking us from reaching out and discovering our own humanity and our own connections, you know, at this point? Is it really serving humanity anymore to have all these borders and things like that? And I see all the conflicts, you know, that have come about, both internal, the struggle for power. We talked about the English struggle for power within England, and whenever I think of, I always think about the War of the Roses. When I think about that, it was the two families struggling for power for off and on for 30 years, and the battles and that occurred for the Tudor dynasty to gain its position there. But so I'm just thinking, if these are outdated, maybe the second axial age, these people may have some answers for us. But what Alan or anybody else, what do you guys think?
You know, I'll offer a thought.
Yeah.
I think this current epidemic that we're going through has some very interesting dimensions.
Yes.
One of the earlier parts of your talk, you were talking about small versus large. For instance, you know, early on in the New England, we had villages where democracy was practiced by having town councils.
Right.
Everybody could come and exercise their thoughts and whatever, and give their voice. And as things have gotten larger and larger, why that's become more and more difficult. Very rarely do you have a location where you have so few people that they can all get into one room and make a decision on things. And so we've moved to the other extreme where we have a national government, which is trying to control more territory than all of the nations that we left behind in Europe.
Yeah.
So with the virus today, we've got a dilemma. If you develop rules that work in one part of the nation, they don't necessarily apply, at least at the same time period, in the rest of the country. You know, maybe it was smart to shut New York down, but it wouldn't have made a whole lot of sense to make that a nationwide lockdown, because there were vast areas of the country that this was not necessary. And yet, sooner or later, it has become necessary for those, which is kind of an argument that maybe these decisions need to be made on smaller or local basis.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when that happens, you've got everybody going 14 ways from Sunday, and that kind of defeats the fact that we move throughout the nation quite freely, or truly, we move throughout the world reasonably freely.
Right.
So I think it's an interesting question.
Right, exactly. We one of the things that I believe it was Tarnas talked about, when he talked about the growing technology and our chances of survival are that of a snowball in hell. When he made that statement, and I forgot to mention that when we were talking earlier, he was talking about the growth of technology can get to the point where we become so isolated, and that our relationship to each other begins to shallow out more and more all the time. And it's an interesting thought. That is and I don't know if anybody can see the future of how we do this, but would it work better if our local communities had more power to govern themselves, and that a centralized coordinating, all the central government was a form of coordination, like when we have this virus situation, the ability to coordinate, or if we did away with borders, you no longer have a national defense issue. So there's just a lot of interesting ways of seeing this. And I'm far from knowing what any of the answers are, really, but I just think that this idea of, well, what if we did do away with borders? What if we did put, our societies did refocus and put a greater emphasis on our local communities? How would that affect travel worldwide? Our rapid travel is what's made the virus a pandemic instead of located in one area. So, I mean, these are very interesting questions.
You say the same. You see the same relative to local travel. I'm sorry.
Yeah, local, to begin to develop communities that are more localized as a point. So we bring out more, I think one of the challenges is to bring us more into interpersonal interactions and relationships. Instead of a greater and greater distancing, maybe part of the second axial age, to create more interpersonal relationships, more community types of relationships, become more localized, instead of these national powers, where we have, these powers are now in competition with Chairman Xi in China, and Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, we're here in the States, this intensity of competition between these powers. There's a question, does that really serve you and I? What is the purpose of government? Is it to serve us as its population? Or, you know, what is the actual purpose? Or is the government, are these governments serving our needs? Or would we be better served with our local? Of course, I've also found local kind of hard to, like I had a tax issue in Clay County this last year. Heaven forbid I talked to somebody who's a decision maker. I even went to the courthouse. And I never did get up the chain of command. So, you know, maybe it's the structure or whatever, but I don't know. There's something, I don't have any answers. I know idealistically what's nice, what works. I think we have these patterns to consider. The patterns show us the direction we're heading. And they also get us to decide whether we like that direction or not. And if we don't like the direction, then what changes should we make? And we intersperse tribalism in here for two reasons. One is the stereotypes are wrong and to correct that. And the other reason is to ask the question, do they have options for us? Maybe a mixture of nation, state, tribal. Maybe it's time to not coexist, but coalesce those two processes into a single one. You know, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Can they be synthesized? Is there something tribalism has to offer us that we've been ignoring? And I do know we've been ignoring it, so maybe it's time for us to look at them more seriously. But any other thoughts on that?
Gil, I was thinking that meditation in the schools is a really good idea, starting in grade school and going all the way through, because I think that that's one way to kind of get more spiritual. And also all the people I know that have gotten into the healing energy. It's been really interesting because it's the only thing I've ever learned that actually evolved and transformed in a way that's really hard to explain to anybody else, but it's really expands your consciousness. And as far as like the snowball's chance in hell, I'd have to agree with that. I just read a book on Rocky Flats and the cleanup. And basically they said we don't have the technology to deal with.
To deal with what?
At least we don't have the order to.
Okay. Yeah, Wendy, your comment reminds me of when I was teaching in high school, seniors. That semester I was teaching a psychology course. And there was a chapter on the dealt kind of with, excuse me a minute. Dealing with what you were talking about. And there were 2 or 3 pages in the textbook that dealt with meditation. So I had my students meditate. And so one of the students apparently went home and told the parents, And the parents complained to the principal. I was called into the principal's office, and he said, "You can't do that in the class." And so I said, "Oh, yeah, it's part of the curriculum." And I opened the textbook to the pages where it talked about meditation. He said, "Well, you don't need to do it that much." So, but I think you're right. You know, there's meditation has a lot of usefulness to it. There's a lot of calming factors to it, and but you kind of deal sometimes with this resistance, you know, thesis, antithesis, and so on, kind of a thing, even on a small scale like that. But I got chastised, and that was interesting. Even though I had the book with me and showed him where it was in the book that the school district had accepted. Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Any other comments or statements? Well, I want to thank everyone for coming and for the, I guess, 6 weeks. Well, we used 7 Wednesdays, but 6 weeks in a day, I guess, if you want to get technical about it. But I want to thank everybody for coming. I really enjoyed doing this. It was a lot of fun. And I want to thank Lori for all of her help and work and so on. And everybody for your comments and participation. And hope the course had some meaning for you. And,
no, you gave me an awful lot to think about. I've been pretty quiet because I haven't decided how I feel about an awful lot of these things, but I do have a lot of things to think about.
Oh, well, thank you, Carol.
Yeah. Like how do we do this on a large scale? How do I understand the tribal thing, but I don't know how it works in a country. I just don't know how to deal with all of it.
Well, you and I are in the same boat.
Yeah, you're not the only one.
Yeah, I want to look at some of the sources you gave us, some of these the individuals, and so. Maybe I can reach some kind of conclusion, but I don't have anything yet.
Yeah, well, you can check the YouTube on the second Axial Age and the 2 people there, but there's other people that I also went through and looked that gave some pretty strong presentations on the second Axial Age too. But, you know, not having enough time to go into all what some of these ideas. Basically, I just saw a return in what they're saying. Yeah. Just as a summary, to return back and to open up to each other more and go kind of scale this down to a smaller scale, make it more personal and things like that, and reconnect with the environment. And of course, the issues with the environment we're having right now may be something that may be happening anyway. So, but you know, that was kind of a summary of what I got from, I think I went through those 2 and about 3 other people on the second Axial Age and their talks on it and so on. And basically that's what I got. I thought Wendell Berry and Father Berry both were moving in that same direction.
Well, I will go look at both of those sources. And I also want to look up about these women in red dresses. Is that still ongoing, or how do I get further information about all of that?
Go to NCIC and see if, I forget what I put in there. I think I put murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls in order to pull those figures out, if I remember correctly. Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian probably also has that connection because they did a red dress display there. I don't know if it's still present, but they had that up for some time at the National Museum.
So look up red dress something or another.
Yeah, put the red dress display murdered and missing Indian women and girls. Jamie, let's see, let me go back real quick. Jamie, Jamie Black, Matee artist, is the one that came up with, I guess, apparently the red dress at the Smithsonian. And so you might look her up too.
Okay.
But the actual figures I got from NCIC.
Okay.
I have kind of an off-the-wall comment, which will, well, maybe say more about me than I want to, but there is a move to revisit psychedelics now in a therapeutic setting.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's going to happen, but that would certainly be a way to enter spirituality in a non-threatening way.
Yes. I think spirituality probably is a significant factor. And because it is the channel which speaks to all racial groups, all cultures, and it leaps national border lines. You know, it's goes right across the borders and that kind of thing. And spirituality, I'm not speaking about religion per se, but for me, spirituality is about connecting. And I have, in speaking about this final slide, I almost forgot it. So Carolyn, I'm glad you said that because just helped me to remember. The final slide in the whole program, balance and harmony. It is the natural world that keeps us connected to each other. Once we disconnect from nature, it is only a matter of time before we disconnect from each other and our own authenticity. And to me, that summarizes what spirituality is about. It's really about connecting to each other and also being inclusive and accepting each other. Is like sitting there in an ashram in India and being open to that, but it didn't mean I had to lose my roots. I didn't have to do that to be open and to be inclusive. And I grew through the process and didn't lose where my roots were located. And I think that's, to me, a very strong message about maybe what the second axial age may be all about, in a sense.
Gil, I'm reading a book called Fantastic Fungi, How Mushrooms Can Heal, Shift Consciousness, and Save the Planet.
Yeah.
And there's a companion movie called The Magic Beneath Us, which really relates to what Carolyn was saying and what your slide just showed.
Yeah, we're writing that down. Say it again.
Oh, the movie is The Magic Beneath Us, and the book is Fantastic Fungi by Paul Stamets. And it really gets into these themes.
Okay.
Oh, and I also wanted to say on the local versus federal, I really agree with Truman. It's like you really need to protect civil rights at a federal level because there's too much religious and political bickering at the local level.
Yes.
And so civil rights for every group, for gay people, for Indians, for Black people. I mean, I just think it really needs to be federally, and women. I mean, it really needs to happen at the federal level.
I think you're right. It does, given the climate in the country today and in the past. If we work towards more inclusivity and more openness to differences, maybe that would move us to a point where we wouldn't need that. But I think right now, the current climate, we probably do. Yes.
Of course, Kansas tries to strongly suggest or even mandate something that to me is as common sense as wearing a mask in
Yes.
other places when you're in with a group. It's, that speaks, of course, to the political dichotomy of this country at this point.
Exactly. Exactly. It's for me, when I put the mask on and I go someplace out there, which I don't do that very often these days, but when I do, I'm putting it on to protect other people. And that's my responsibility to my community to do that. Some of the science, more recent science, is saying there is some element of protection of yourself as well with the mask. But basically it protects other people. Yeah. Right. So we have it mandated now. I don't know how many places in the metro it is, but I really feel like the population or the people need to take initiative and take responsibility for protecting their community. And it's a segment of American population doesn't quite see it that way.
That's for sure.
Yeah, right. So, but if we all felt like that, then you begin to take some of the responsibility off of the political system, and therefore it could move us closer to that second axial age concept of more of a localized and greater connection with each other and nature and the environment. So that's kind of where I see that going, that second axial age concept. Yeah.
Well, Gil, I've got to drop out and get to something else, but thank you so much for a really thought-provoking course.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you, Ellen. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody here. And I've really enjoyed it myself.